Hey everyone, I'm Belle Reid, and I'm super excited to be officially kicking off a new series here on my channel called That Sounds Weird. If you are new to my channel, I'm a musician and sound designer who makes experimental music with trumpet, modular synthesizers, and other electronic instruments. I am obsessed with sound, and I love finding unique ways to create strange, noisy, surprising, beautiful sonic worlds. So in this series, I'm going to be sharing my favorite synthesis, sound design, and music production techniques for creating all kinds of weird sounds, as well as ideas for how you could possibly use these sounds in your music. To kick things off, I'm going to be sharing one of my favorite synthesis techniques of all time, which is cross modulation. All right, so what is cross modulation? In brief, cross modulation is the process of using the output of one device to modulate a second device, and then using the output of that second device to modulate the first one. So for example, if we use two oscillators, we can use one oscillator to modulate the frequency of oscillator 2 and the second oscillator to modulate the frequency of oscillator 1. So by doing this, we're creating a sort of feedback loop between the two oscillators, which, as you can hear, results in a lot of instability and nonlinearities in the sound and in the oscillator controls. Changing the frequency knob on one oscillator, for example, which would typically just make the pitch go up or down, can cause the sound to break apart into a million pieces and just sound really amazing. This technique can vary a lot depending on the waveforms you're using for cross modulation, the modulation depth on both oscillators, and of course, the output that you're listening to. Right now, we are using sine waves for everything, but let's go ahead and switch everything over to pulse waves, for example. Awesome. So of course, since we're now monitoring the pulse wave output, the sound is pretty intense. If we want to hear the same modulation character, but with a somewhat softer sound, we could monitor the sine output instead. I definitely recommend experimenting with different waveform combinations for both modulation and monitoring because there is a huge range of results that you can access. I also want to mention that while this technique does lend itself to super chaotic, noisy sounds, it is still possible to find moments of stillness and slightly more stable textures. The best way to approach this technique is to turn knobs slowly and explore every possible combination of control settings because you really never know what you'll discover. Cross modulation will also sound really different depending on the gear you're using, because different manufacturers parameterize and scale inputs and outputs on their modules differently. Some modules, like the Make Noise DPO, have the ability to perform cross-modulation built right into the module itself without any patching required. So this is a dual oscillator that has normal signal connections behind the panel for modulation from oscillator 1 to 2 and back from 2 to 1. So that means that you just need to turn up these attenuators on the panel to hear the cross-modulation effect. The normal connection on DPO uses sine waves for both oscillators. So if we want to try cross-modulation with different waveforms, we can patch that manually. Something else that's really interesting is to monitor the outputs from each oscillator simultaneously, but to pan them to different locations in the stereo field. This creates a really strange sort of organic sense of motion, somewhat like we're panning the signal, but the nature of the stereo image is intrinsically linked to the cross-modulation process itself. You'll notice that the stereo image seems to change as I vary the oscillator frequencies and depth of modulation. Really quick, before we move forward, I want to take a sec to tell you about my online class, Learning Sound and Synthesis. Learning Sound and Synthesis is a super comprehensive and step-by-step program that teaches you everything you need to make music with modular synthesizers, to design your own sounds from scratch, and to turn your synth sounds and patches into complete compositions and performances. Whether you want to make ambient soundscapes, melodic generative music, synth pop, techno, noisy, chaotic sci-fi sounds, or anything in between. When you join Learning Sound and Synthesis, you'll also get access to an incredibly supportive community of people who, just like you, are super passionate about electronic music and modular synths. And you'll also be able to get personalized support and feedback on your music. I typically offer Learning Sound and Synthesis 1 to 2 times per year. You can learn more and join the waitlist for the next round by going to soundandsynthesis.com/waitlist. Learning synth and synthesis. So far, we've only been exploring oscillator-based cross-modulation using the FM inputs, but you can cross-modulate virtually any parameter you want. For example, you could try cross-sync. Or you could try cross pulse width modulation. Or you could try FM in one direction and sync in the other. Or both cross-modulated FM and sync at the same time. opinion, these sounds are awesome on their own, but you can also give them a little bit of shape and articulation by adding in an envelope and a VCA or a filter, and they can transform into some really gnarly and interesting sounding percussion. Something else that's really fun to do is to use something like a sequencer or a touch keyboard to modulate additional parameters of the sound. So for example, here I'm cross-modulating on the DPO with FM as we were before, and I'm simultaneously running the zero control into the volt per octave of the second oscillator and to the shape modulation input on DPO. Although cross-modulation is most commonly explored using oscillators, you can try this technique with pretty much any two voltage controllable devices, and you can get to some really interesting results. For example, we could cross-modulate two low-frequency oscillators to create a chaotic modulation source. So in this patch, I'm cross-modulating the two sides of maths. I have them both set to cycle, so they're acting as LFOs, and I'm using that modulation source to modulate this filter. Or we could try cross-modulating one oscillator and one filter. So for example, in this patch, I'm running the saw wave output from XPO into the Acarié filter. The output from the Acarié filter is being used to modulate the XPO. It's going into the exponential FM input here. Then I'm also sending the Veritimbre output from XPO to modulate the Acarié filter. So that's the cross-modulation loop there. And what we're listening to is actually just the sine wave output directly from XPO. So we're not listening to the output of the filter, just the sine wave output from XPO. All right, awesome. So as I'm sure you can see, cross-modulation is a really simple but really deep technique that can result in a huge range of dynamic textures, sounds, and timbres. It's something that I personally reach for a lot in my own music because it can be so surprising. And even though I've been using this technique for years, I still feel like I discover something new every time I try it. As you've seen, these techniques can vary a lot depending on the gear you're using. So it's always something that I'm really excited to try out whenever I get a new module or a new instrument. I personally find it super fascinating that with just 2 patch cables, you can turn something as simple and pure as a sine wave into something super unpredictable and chaotic. If you give any of these ideas a try, let me know in the comments what you discover, and I hope you have fun exploring. And if you're looking for an amazing community of people who are passionate about things like modular synthesis and sound design and experimental music, or if you're interested in things like behind the scenes content and unreleased audio, then I would love to invite you to check out and possibly join my Patreon community. You can learn more by going to patreon.com/Sarah Belle Reid. All right, that's it for today. As always, thank you for watching and for listening, and I'll see you next time.